May I have your attention, please? Dear friends, dear partners, I would like to have the great honor to introduce our special guest of tonight, Professor Mohan Munasinghe. Professor Munasinghe, please. He is a physicist and economist by training. Professor Munasinghe is also a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. He shared this outstanding honor with former Vice President Al Gore in 2007. Professor Munasinghe has gained international recognition for outlining the framework of sustained Omics at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, and more generally for playing a central role in the development of a holistic approach to sustainability. As you know, promoting a comprehensive approach to inclusive and sustainable economic growth lies at the heart of the Zermatt Summit's mission. So I have no doubt that Professor's presentation will provide a major contribution to our discussions and will inspire our thinking on the concrete ways we can all contribute to a sustainable future. We will now have Professor make his speech, and then please think of the questions you might have. We will then have questions during the dessert. Thank you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Wasserman, Christopher, for that generous introduction. And also, thank you very much for inviting me to this summit. Congratulations first for having the idea of the Zermatt Summit and for having a fourth event. And I wish you many more. It's a privilege to address the cream of the business and, of course, the civil society community who are deeply committed to the cause of sustainability. So it is my privilege to be here. I'm going to talk about what business and civil society partnership can do now for a more sustainable future. Now, normally I have slides, but I was told that on this occasion, that would be a bit heavy with your dinner. So I will try to make do with words. But if anybody is interested in any specific idea, I have a set of slides which you are very welcome to have. So just do get in touch with me if that is the case. Let us start by thinking about what the multiple challenges are that we face. Okay? Why do we need to talk about sustainability? Why can't we continue with business as usual? Because basically, the business as usual projections suggest a high-risk world where we will not solve the problems of development or the problems of poverty or any of the other major issues. See, we are facing a world where we have multiple issues. The financial economic crisis, which we are still aware of, certainly in the Western countries, but we have also had persistent poverty for a long time. We have resource shortages, water, food, energy, and the like, and we have various kinds of environmental damage, the most dramatic of which is climate change. Climate change we consider the ultimate threat amplifier because it makes all the other problems worse. We need what I call integrated solutions to solve these problems. I'm sure in the earlier sessions you have discussed this, so I apologize to belabor the same point, but it is well worth making. I'm also sorry that I missed your earlier sessions. I think it's very rude to come in here and then leave, but my schedule is such that I don't have the time to spend with you, but I will certainly read all the documents that emerge from these sessions. So basically these integrated solutions need a certain amount of effort. And it is, I think, groups like yourself who will contribute. Why? Because leadership is lacking. The world's leaders are rather uncoordinated because different countries have diverging interests. There is a lack of political will. So the essence of what I'm going to tell you today, one of the chief points, is that we cannot wait for global leaders to make decisions. It will be far too late. I think business and civil society have to push the leadership and governments in the right direction, not to oppose them in the sense of having further dissension and conflict, but to develop the kind of ideas and to give courage to those leaders who lack the courage to take the right steps. Now, let me just mention very briefly also the issue of climate change and why it is a threat amplifier, because it particularly affects poor countries and poorer groups throughout the world. This is manifestly unfair because they had the least to do with creating the problem, but they will bear the brunt of the outcome of climate change. But we have a positive message here as well. The Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, to which I belong, I had a huge report like this, but one part of it, which I was very proud to help author, argues that by making development more sustainable, which is bending the curve of development, we can not only solve the problems of poverty and hunger and resource shortages, but also address climate change. So this is what we mean by integrated solutions. Why? Because we find that piecemeal solutions do not seem to work. Sometimes we try to solve one problem, we make the other problem worse, right? Because it's a complex world and they are all interrelated at a deeper level. Now, having talked about the kinds of solutions we need, let's ask ourselves, how are we doing today? Okay? What do we need to change? Now, I present to you a very sort of sketchy picture of the world at 3 levels of reality, right? One is the level of financial markets, GNP, economic growth. That is the part that deals with monetary aggregates. And definitely it captures our minds. I mean, our head is in the clouds. We want to make more money. Right? Below that, we have a level of what we call productive economic assets, the capital, the labor, and so on that produce these monetary wealth. Right? That is what economists deal with. And it is also important because the value of these assets should be closely aligned to what they are in the financial marketplace. Okay? But below the level of the economic assets, you have the biogeophysical resources of the planet, and that is nature. And ultimately, the third level should also be aligned with the other two to have a well-functioning world. But this is not what is happening. If you look at the 2008 asset bubble, what you found was a bubble created of false value which separated the financial markets from the value of the real economic asset, whether it was a financial derivative or property values. And when that bubble collapsed, you had major disruption. So that is the economic bubble. But you also have a social bubble. What is a social bubble? We are seeing all this talk about high GNP growth rates, but it hides an ugly reality that there are almost 2 billion poor people on the planet. Okay? So where is the well-being for those people? There is another social bubble there, and it is also a very dangerous one. And the third bubble, which separates the third level of reality, is what in economic terms we call environmental harm or externalities, and that is basically that in the process of production and consumption, we are using natural resources in such a way that we are damaging it for the future. Okay? So that is another bubble. So this whole phenomenon is kind of use now, pay later. It's the debt syndrome in every aspect. And if we look at how the world's leaders have reacted to these, for the financial crisis, $6 trillion, $6,000 billion was found in very short order, in a matter of months, to solve the problem. It went mainly to banks and rich institutions. I'm not saying that we should allow the banks to collapse, but only 100 billion is given to aid for the poor, which is 1/50th that amount. And if you look at the problems of environment, the third bubble, like climate change, a few $1 billion are doled out here or there. So then of course, world military expenditure is now running at $2 trillion a year, 2 trillion, 2,000 billion. So with those kinds of priorities, I suggest to you that we're not going to solve any of the fundamental problems, right? And that is why we need this push from the bottom to make the change. Now, let me also tell you that there have been some changes in the world which will affect the outcome. And that is the emergence of some developing countries, the emerging economies, one really now driving the global economy. Basically China, Brazil, and India, whereas the traditional West, the industrialized West, is still struggling to come out of the recession. So this also suggests that we have to focus attention certainly on sustainability in those emerging markets and also the poorer countries. And I will suggest what that means, but there is also a message for the rich countries here, and that I'll come to that at the end very quickly. Now, the way forward really is not to continue with business as usual, because it's a very high-risk scenario. In the business as usual, we are looking basically at piecemeal solutions driven mainly by governments who are reacting to change. They are not being proactive. So they wait till the crisis happens and they try to fix it. And this simply is not going to work. We are looking at one problem at a time. We're trying to solve an environmental problem here, a financial problem there. The linkages are not well understood. So that kind of high-risk world, business as usual, is not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at something more fundamental. What are the drivers? We find that there are 4 forces, in my view, that drive many of the problems we face. The 4 drivers are consumption, the way we consume and what we consume, production and the technology of production, governance, or mainly misgovernance, because there's a lot of that going on, and of course, population, right? Now, if you look, for example, at the post-financial crisis, you will see that the financial sector, at least in my view, has not learned very much from the crisis. There is a sense that they're going back to business as usual. So are we going to have another problem in another 10 years from now? So we have to avoid that. And we have to look at these fundamental drivers to make those changes. Let me also tell you that we do have a framework. I mean, these are not ad hoc ideas that I'm talking to you about. Some of us have thought about it, like you. I have the framework of Sustainomics was very generously mentioned by you, Mr. Chairman. I presented this first at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and it is alive and well. It is being taught in universities, it's applied in many countries and sectors. And it has some principles which inform us, which I think will be helpful to us in terms of what we want to do. The first concept in this is called making development more sustainable. Okay, it's a call for empowerment and action, because what it says is the move for sustainability is like learning to climb a mountain. The peak is covered with clouds, it's sustainable development. It's all very mysterious, even to me, right? But if we are climbing, if we take one step at a time and go up the hill, we will eventually reach it. So it's up to you and I to do that, to take those steps, not wait for our leaders to define this. We have lost many years fighting over what exactly sustainable development means. But on the other hand, how to make development more sustainable is relatively easy in the sense that a lot of activities that we do that are unsustainable can be corrected right now. When I leave the room, I switch off the light. I turn off a tap. I plant a tree. I may choose to eat less meat, okay, or not take a flight. There are a lot of actions we can take. So that's what we mean by making development more sustainable. Not to feel helpless. And I shouldn't be telling you this. You're telling me that by your presence here. Okay, so you are really preaching. I'm preaching to the converted here, but that's a message that we have to spread because people really are waiting for Obama or Hu Jintao or David Cameron or somebody else to do something. My personal belief is they are not going to do anything in time to save us unless we push them to do it. Right? So this is the first point. The second point, just beyond that, I think at the corporate level, also we can do a lot. I mean, we have concepts of corporate social responsibility. Now, in business schools, when I give lectures, I talk about CSR plus, going beyond the traditional CSR, so that it's not just a greenwash, but looking at things like shared value, really going deeply into sustainability accounting and reporting and the triple bottom line, making sure that these values permeate at all levels of the company, encouraging impact investment, the kinds of investors, niche investors who are looking for sustainability in the companies that they invest in and so on. So these are directions we have to encourage at the corporate level. And we don't need governments to tell us that. We can do it. Okay? So at the national level, and this is again aimed at government leaders, I can tell you as a scientist that we have in fact the models and the methods to incorporate sustainability principles into all the mainstream sectors of the economy. We can green or make agriculture more sustainable. We can do it for industry. We can do it for transport. Why is it not being applied? Because the policy analysts and the top people, the bureaucrats, are also lazy. They have certain values. They don't want to change. They feel uncomfortable and so on. But these changes have to come about. So they say, oh, this is too complicated. This is the way we've been doing it for so many years and so on. Why do we need to change? For example, one of the things that I'm working now is with the King of Bhutan, working on a concept of gross national happiness, okay? We're not throwing away GNP. What we're saying is that gross national product and production is one aspect of contentment and well-being. Very important, especially if you're poor and you have no food in your stomach. You don't want to hear about happiness without a good meal. But, once you satisfy basic needs, what I'm going to argue is that continued pursuit of material consumption is actually going to bring us into major problems. So the gross national happiness is trying to find a set of indicators which includes GNP and material consumption, but also other things, including spiritual values and other things, which we all know intrinsically are important to us, but are never included in the measures of decision making, right? Either at the government level or corporate level or anything else. So this is rather important, and this brings me really to the second concept in Sustainomics, and that is the Sustainable Development Triangle, which you've seen now many times, the economic, the social, and the environmental. The first time I proposed it was in 1992. There was a lot of dissension at the time, and particularly the environmentalists disliked it completely because they said sustainable development is the economic thing. What have environmentalists got to do with it? But by 20 years afterwards, I think we know it's the balance between those three elements that is important. So we certainly need economic principles, pricing, growth, other things, to drive the economy, also to bring the poor out of poverty, right? But the social side, inclusion, participation, income distribution and inequality, those kinds of concerns are there. As I said, it's one of the bubbles that's hidden. And of course, the environment, we know very well but not only with climate change, but with other kinds of resource problems, that we cannot ignore the environment. Depletion and pollution are very important aspects. So it is not only the three elements, corners of the triangle, but the linkages between them that are extremely important. And so we find that almost any problem that we have to face, whether it is climate change or poverty, has some element of these three dimensions. What we are saying is that every community and every country does not have to have the same balance point. Some countries may prefer a very pristine environment or community. Another group may say, no, we want to make money. Okay. But the balance is very important, and particularly the social side, because there are three types of capital that go with it. You have the economic capital, the buildings and the roads and so on that produce wealth. Okay. We have natural capital, the lakes, the air, the land. We have social capital. And that is neglected. That is the most important kind of capital which is being eroded. It is the glue that binds us together, the value systems. And this is causing major problems in the sense that erosion of social capital is one of the serious problems that we face. So I think that the Zermatt Summit and groups like yourselves have much to do to restore the balance between these three types of capital. For example, what is the point of having a glittering city with skyscrapers and highways if a woman cannot walk the street without her safety? Okay? So that, if the social capital is lacking, I think then this is not a sustainable city. Okay. So let me move to the third aspect, and that is also extremely important, and that is called transcending boundaries. This is something that we do within our own minds. What are the values we have to transcend? First is values, okay? That is, we find that greed and selfishness and violence are manifestly unsustainable. We've seen this in 2008. We see this in the wars and conflicts going on around us. But it is being repeated. So we have to find ways in which selflessness, altruism, enlightened self-interest, very important in business, which basically says you can make money, but you can still do good. And when you do good to others, they will do good to you. Okay, this message is forgotten in the greed is good syndrome. So these are very important principles which I try to teach also in business schools with the new generation of managers. But we also have to transcend other boundaries, the boundaries of space, to go from the local to the global, of time, not only to think in terms of days or months, but years, sometimes decades, and even centuries. And certainly we have to transcend the boundaries of what I call stakeholder interests. And that is where I argued that business and civil society have to work with government, cannot be passive. Okay? And stakeholders have to work in cooperation to solve this problem. Now, unfortunately, we have a situation where it is not a sustainable triangle, but an unsustainable triangle that is driving the world. And that is what we have to break. We have unethical social values driving us, which is greed, selfishness, corruption, violence. That has led to a model of what we call economic maldevelopment. So this is not sustainable development. That is based essentially on unsustainable debt and inequitable consumption patterns. So if you look at our ancestors, say our grandparents, I think they saved a lot more than us. It is their saving and their investment that we are enjoying today. But we have discovered a different truth in our generation, which is that better than to save is to borrow. So we enjoy our grandparents' saving, but we borrow from our grandchildren, and we have even a better life, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that you should stop eating and drinking, but just reflect as you do on this, that it is that debt syndrome which has led now to the environmental debt. And that debt is something that our children and grandchildren will have to pay in a serious way. And as resources become scarce, it drives another cycle of violence because it leads to more conflict, more greed, so the social values become even more distorted. I think a lot of the wars going on now are not over weapons of mass destruction, they are over resources. Okay? The arguments are presented one way, but the underlying reasons are very different. So we have to break those kinds of molds, right? And I think we can, but we have this problem of time. Okay? We are going down a slippery slope. I think change will come. Either we are wise enough to turn and go back up, or we fall off the cliff. Either way, change will come. If we fall off the cliff, of course, 100 million people will die. I mean, so that is not a desirable outcome, but it will happen. So why not do the wise thing? Now, let me also tell you that this is not an empty box. I mean, what I've been talking about, that we have analytical tools and methods. It has been applied in a number of countries, in companies, in sectors, and so on. And we have many case studies, which I don't really have time to go into in this talk. But let me just move on to the next point, and which is relating to climate change, because it's a catchy topic. And just to tell you one kind of metaphor that will illustrate this point. See, if you look at the carbon dioxide that has been put up in the air, mainly after the Industrial Revolution, we are now at a level which is 35% over the safe limit, right? And it is rising very rapidly in spite of all the talk, in spite of all the agreements, the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so forth. The sea level is rising, and the prognosis is that the current is very gloomy, that by 2050 we will have probably something of the order of 20 or 30 centimeters, and by the end of the century, probably about close to a meter rise in sea level. Temperatures will rise 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, and the danger limit is considered 2 degrees. So we have already pretty much given up on holding it to the 2-degree limit. But this will have serious consequences for many people in poor countries, which means that the two solutions to climate change which have been proposed now take on a very vital dimension. One of the solutions is called mitigation, which is reducing carbon emissions. That is mainly the responsibility of the high emitters, which they have shirked. In fact, the US backed out, for example, of the Kyoto Protocol completely, although it was a weak agreement. So mitigation is not being done, and decisions are being postponed. But there's the other side called adaptation. Adaptation tells you, so mitigation tells you reduce emissions so that climate change is not worse. Adaptation tells you some climate change is going to happen, so take precautions. So if the sea level goes up, like the Dutch, you build a wall to keep the sea out, right? That kind of. So now, for the poorer countries and poorer communities, adaptation is a very high priority, because otherwise we're going to see, in a matter of decades, we don't have to wait to the end of the century, major problems because of storms and hurricanes and other things which will hit these communities. So we know how to protect the poor, the children and the elderly who are the most vulnerable. We know how to protect the most vulnerable regions, which include small islands. You may have seen the Arctic, the Asian megadeltas, and sub-Saharan Africa. You may have seen a few years ago that the president of the Maldives at the time had a cabinet meeting underwater to make the point that his entire country would be submerged, right? So we learned that all the ministers could do scuba diving, but but it was also very dramatic. So what I'm saying is we know what to do this adaptation. We know what to do to mitigate, which is to reduce carbon emissions, but nothing is being really done. Okay, this is the tragedy, and we have to ask ourselves why. The current excuse is, look, there's a world economic crisis. How can we, think of climate change when we have to get more jobs and save the banks and so on, right? But let me just end with the following part, and that is that if you look at the development path of countries, you see that the rich countries have consumed a lot of resources, and they are at high here. They are certainly consuming carbon above the safe level. Poor countries are down here, okay? And there are a lot of countries in the middle. Now the question here is, how do we do several things? First, the rich have to reduce their consumption, which is called dematerialization. Doesn't mean that they disappear. Means that they use less resources. And we have the technology to do it, and I'll mention that in a couple of minutes' time. But basically, what we are saying is that we can have a good life, maintain our quality of life, but with much less burden on the Earth's resources. We have the technologies and the policies to do that. But there is another part of this. We have to have a safety net for the poor, for example, the Maldives or sub-Saharan Africa and so on, so that the poor can come out of poverty, and the middle income group who are growing. Now, we cannot afford to have those hundreds of millions of middle-class people growing along the same profligate curve of the West, because there just are not enough resources for 7 or 8 or 9 billion people on the planet to have the same lifestyle of the United States. But fortunately, again, I have a message of hope. We have models and methods where we can find a flatter path of development. And countries like China, where I work, and Brazil, are seriously trying to do this, right? People who say that China is dirty and is very pollution, but at the stage of development that they are now compared to, they say, what UK was at the same, they are much cleaner and much more efficient. So you have, what I'm saying is they are finding a flatter, a better path to development, and we wish them well in that, because without that, the entire planet is going to suffer, right? So this is basically the other part of the bargain, that those who grow have to grow out of poverty and become wealthy, but in a more sustainable way. And we have to have the kinds of technology cooperation and knowledge transfer that will help them. And this is something that entrepreneurs like yourself, leading business people, should take into consideration as you consider partnerships in those countries. Now, we have also new tools and methods. I mentioned gross national happiness, but we have also humbler methods like green national accounts, where we can make adjustments to GNP to account for environmental damages. I worked on that for 20 years with the UN. It is now officially accepted by the UN, but not a single country has applied those environmental corrections. Okay? They still use only the GNP for their, and that is what is put in the newspapers, and that is a major problem. So let me just come to the concluding part of my presentation about what the business community and civil society can do. If you look at the evolution of attitudes in the business community, in 1962, Milton Friedman said that the business of a business is to make as much money as possible for shareholders. That's what he said. He was a high priest of capitalism, also a Nobel Prize winner in economics, 1962. But today we have very different. I mean, you have a quote from PricewaterhouseCoopers a couple of years ago, which says, sustainability has moved from the fringes of the business world to the top of the shareholders' agenda. I hope this is true. That is the kind of evolution of thinking that must happen, and much faster also. The Chinese are talking about a vision of a global eco-civilization. I was there during the time of the 18th Party Congress last year, and this concept was mentioned. It was raised with President Obama in the recent meeting that the Prime Minister had, the Chinese Prime Minister, and the communique was very revealing because the Chinese gave their vision for decades, several decades, and President Obama gave his medium term for the next 3 years. I'm not faulting, I mean, it's just the system and the way that people. So although we are not sure that the Chinese will deliver, or the Brazilians or anybody else, we wish them well, because that is the direction we have to go. And we need, in my view, and I have just a few minutes more, so let me make it count, a vision where socially we should like to meet the basic needs of all human beings to live in peace and harmony. Environmentally, we need to respect nature and reduce our global resource use to what one planet can produce. Okay? We should not exceed the capacity of the planet. And on the economic side, we can have a sustainable economy which respects social and environmental constraints, but it is still prosperous and resource efficient. Okay, and this can be done. This, one of the important tools for this, which is a practical tool that you should consider, is basically sustainable consumption and production. The first two drivers of that I mentioned at the beginning, consumption and production. Because why? Because we have now an ecological footprint of humanity which is consuming 1.5 times the planet Earth, soon twice the planet's resources. So we are exceeding the carrying capacity already. 85% almost of those resources are used by the 20% of the richest people in the world, 1.4 billion. So the rich are already consuming more than one planet worth, right? And at the same time, in the Millennium Development Goals, we are promising 2 billion poor. Yes, we will raise you out of poverty. I ask you, where are the resources to raise those people out of poverty? So I have suggested something called Millennium Consumption Goals, which will complement the Millennium Development Goals. And this is basically saying that the rich have a commitment to bring down their consumption, but without giving up the good life. The poor should rise out of poverty, but along a flatter path, without also following the bad example of the industrialized countries. And what are the two goals? One is that every human being, this is Millennium Consumption Goal 1, every human being on the planet should have their basic needs met. The Millennium Development Goals, which are now on the UN books, do not explicitly guarantee that, the basic consumption. They say, okay, we will reduce poverty, but I think we should guarantee consumption of basic needs, energy, water, food, health, education for every human being on the planet. Once we give that commitment, then we have to find the resources to do it. And there, the second Millennium Consumption Goal comes in, which is how to make the lifestyle of the affluent more sustainable. And there are many ways. I mean, particularly, for example, food waste. 50% of the food that reaches the American home is wasted. In Europe, it's closer to 30%. So there are a lot of ways in which people can contribute by reducing the burden on the planet's resources. And so at the same time you reduce obesity, you can improve your lifestyle and become healthier and happier at the same time. So becoming more sustainable in your consumption does not mean that you have to give up everything. And basically it means that you take charge of your consumption and don't let the consumption define you. Okay, so it's not, but unfortunately with young people, it's the iPhone or the iPad or whatever it is that defines that person, not that the person defines their consumption. So it's the wrong way round, and it's a question of values. We need to help the younger people find the correct values, but first we have to change our own values. And the second Millennium Consumption Goal, we have already begun this with a voluntary process. I have, for example, 2,000 cities in Europe, the Climate Alliance, who have agreed with the Millennium Consumption Goals, and they are saying at the city level, we will give a commitment to reduce our energy footprint, our carbon footprint, and so on. Companies have come forward and made those commitments on their website. So this is the final message to you, the positive message, and that is we don't really have to wait for global leaders. There are people who will say, well, what can the grassroots do? And I tell you, there is a middle level of leadership, CEOs of companies, mayors of cities, and so on, who are much more in tune with the grassroots, who are much more bold and decisive than the national leaders. The mayor of Bonn, who I was speaking to a few months ago, is very enthusiastic about this. And he says, just imagine if all the cities in Germany agreed to make certain cuts, then we can go to Chancellor Merkel and tell her, you can agree too, because it's very easy for you. All the cities have agreed. So I'm saying that at this middle level, we can energize, and from the grassroots, we need the push upwards. So that is Millennium Consumption Goals. We are appealing to the affluent and telling them, you are better educated, you are more influential, you have a greater stake in the system. It's like the Titanic. You can be on the top deck having caviar and champagne, and when the ship goes down, it's the sailors at the bottom who die first, but eventually you will also be swimming for your life. So there is, I think, a very important self-interest element here. So let me end on that thought and tell you that on the consumption side, there are many things we can do. Pricing policy is extremely important, so I do not give up on markets. I think we have to reform markets. Markets are important. It is unrestrained markets that are causing the problem, but we can use pricing, advertising, which is misused, that we are tweaking people to consume more. The same type of advertising can tweak people to consume more sustainably. And on the production side, we have many, many methods, I don't have to tell you, of improving the efficiency of resource use. So on the production side, I will not say anything. Basically, my final message to you is the following. The world is extremely complex. The problems we face are extremely complex. But we should not give up hope. We should feel energized and empowered because we know what to do, step by step, to make those changes. So let us have this coalition of civil society and business to work with government. And I think the Zermatt Summit is one of the institutions that will help to save this planet. Thank you very much indeed.